Well, good morning. Happy almost New Year. We are incredibly grateful for the opportunity to spend an hour or so of your Sunday morning with us. I know there are other places you could be, other things you could be doing. You chose to be here with us. We just don't ever take that for granted. So thanks for spending this time here with us as we kind of close out 2023 and look into a new year. We are, as Pam said in the welcome, we are in the middle of a very long series of messages called the Jesus Project. The Jesus Project is our best attempt to cover in a 3-year period everything that Jesus said and did as we have it recorded in the Gospels. It's a ridiculous project on my part. People who are here at New Life have been good enough to indulge me at least in this project, so I appreciate that. Those of you who are new this morning and haven't been here before, you are catching us right in the middle, and you're catching us on, admittedly, I'm just going to tell you right now, it's not necessarily a normal Sunday for us. We are a couple of months ago, as part of my life group, I had a realization that we were in the middle of this Jesus Project series, and that there were a lot of people probably who were sitting here on a Sunday morning who I thought had background information from what we would call the Old Testament that didn't have the background information that I thought they had. And I realized as I was doing this that as we were trying to make some of these connections with Jesus from the Old Testament, because the gospel stories are full of all of these references, direct and indirect, to all of these things that happened before the Jesus story, I realized it would be important for me to take some time to actually spend and just say, hey, let's connect ourselves back to some of those stories, maybe some that you are somewhat familiar with, and maybe some that are going to be a little bit of new information for you. And so 2 weeks ago, Sunday before Christmas, if you were here, you remember that we covered some of the Old Testament. And I told you at the time that we were going to, in 2 weeks, cover the entire Old Testament. So if you have never read through, the first 39 books of the Bible, you are just get ready. You're going to get everything you need to know in the next 40-ish minutes or so. And that's the other piece. I don't normally talk for this long. So don't hold this against me. All right, these are the things that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and these are the important things for us to understand about the world that Jesus was living in. And the reason, again, that this is all important, at least for us as we're trying to make sense of Jesus, is because we should understand the world that Jesus lived in. If we're going to understand who Jesus is and why he says the things that he does, and why he does the things that he does, and why his audience thought certain things about what he said and did, we should understand the world that Jesus was living in. And so this is what we covered a couple weeks ago. First, the Hebrew worldview that Jesus was living in took as truth the goodness of creation and of our place in creation. They believed that God created at the beginning, said it was good and it was very good, and set human beings down in the middle of a good and very good creation and said, you guys take care of it, and that they messed it up. Second, that the Hebrew worldview took as truth that it was the purpose of God to reintegrate heaven and earth through the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These three sort of patriarchs, these three pillars of our faith, even our Christian faith, tracking all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and believed that God was trying to bring together heaven and earth as it was meant to be from the beginning through their family and their descendants. And then third thing that we covered 2 weeks ago, was that the Hebrew worldview took as truth the belief that Israel, that nation that came from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was God's treasured possession among all the people of the earth, but it was in anticipation of the day when every nation would belong to him, when heaven and earth would be reunited. That was what people who were hearing Jesus speak and watching Jesus do the things that he did, these are three of the key things that they believe that shaped the way that they saw the world. This week we pick up where we left off a couple of weeks ago, which is that Moses, if you were here, Moses built this tabernacle, this tent for the people of Israel to carry around with them in the wilderness. When he built the tabernacle and the tent, God's presence rested on that tabernacle, and the people saw the reuniting of heaven and earth in this place. They saw for themselves a place where they would meet with God. And as they traveled through all of their wilderness wanderings for 40 years, traveling through the desert until they get to the land that God had promised for them to live in. They brought this tent, this tabernacle with them. When they settle in the land, they settle down and they place the tent in the middle of the people of Israel, and they would continue to go and visit that place as a reminder that God's presence was with his people, that there in that place, heaven was coming to earth. The problem is that the people of Israel were just like us. They were human beings. And as they walked through all of their wilderness wanderings with Moses as a leader and then Joshua as a leader after him, and then after Joshua, things get sort of foggy. And who's going to lead us? And what person is going to be the person that we look to? What's the person that we're going to identify as our leader? And it just sort of travels around to all of these guys, these judges, men and women, who fulfill this function of prophet and judge for the people of Israel. And Israel would have good moments, and then they would have bad moments, and they would have good moments, and they would have bad moments. Does this sound relatively familiar? Does it sound relatively human? They would have good moments, bad moments. Still, they get to this point where they say, we need a king. We need someone that we can identify as our leader. And when they choose a king, they choose the king based on what we would normally choose a king based on, especially if you lived in that time, a person who could provide you military security. And so when they look around all of the Israelites, they find this one guy who's head and shoulders above, physically imposing above all of the other people. They choose a man named Saul. But Saul wasn't a very good king in the sense that he was a great military guy, but he was not a very great follower of God. And so eventually God rejects Saul, says, I'm going to take the kingdom away from him. I'm going to give it to another person. And here's where we come to Act 4, which we would call the crown. And the key person in this act is going to be a person named David, who most of us, at least, are somewhat familiar with. When they came, Samuel, the prophet, looked on Eliab. Sorry, I should give you some little context for that. God sends the prophet to a man named Jesse. And Jesse's sons, he's got 7 sons. He says, from your 7 sons, I'm going to choose a king to be king over my people. And so he says, I want you to gather all of your sons together. And from these 7 sons, we are going to choose the next king over the people of Israel. So when they came, Samuel looked on Eliab, the oldest, and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. In other words, don't make the same mistake we just made with Saul. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And then one by one, all of Jesse's sons pass before the prophet, and the prophet says, God hasn't chosen this one, God hasn't chosen this one, God hasn't chosen this one. Then Samuel said to Jesse, are all of your sons here? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, but behold, he's keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. This is a critical moment in the life of Israel and a critical moment in the Jesus story, because after the fiasco with Saul, Samuel goes to crown the oldest and strongest and most physically imposing looking of Jesse's sons. But God says, I don't want you to choose him. We're not going to do this the way that you want to do it and the way that all of the other people want to do it. My choice for a king is going to be qualified on a different kind of level. What I'm looking for in a king, the king that I'm going to establish over my people, is not about his outward appearance. It has everything to do with what is inside of his heart. And so when David is overlooked, left out in the fields, so that all of Jesse's other sons get the chance to be named the next king, his father doesn't even invite him to the party. His brothers didn't invite him to the party. They left him to do the dirty work out with the sheep. And when the prophet says, I want you to send for him, he says, we're not going to go anywhere until he shows up. And when he shows up, God says, this is the one that I will place my Spirit upon. And as my Spirit is placed on him, he will perform the function of a king over my people. There would be a lot of things that you could look for in a king, but in God's opinion, the most important thing was the humility of David's heart and his receptiveness to God using him to do what God had wanted to do, not to establish himself as a king, not to hold himself up over the people, but to actually serve and shepherd and care for the people. That to be a true king, the true king of this people, would be to reflect the heart of God for them and towards them, and to be led by that task in the Spirit of God. And that's what happens for David. Now, from this moment, David spends 15 years before he becomes the king that Samuel anoints him to be on this day in front of his brothers. 15 years pursued by Saul to the death, almost, on 2 occasions, until he comes into his throne as a king. And as he settles in and begins to establish his throne and begins to establish his leadership over the people, he says to himself, what I would like to do is I would like to build a permanent place for God's presence among his people. I want to build a temple. I don't want God living in this tabernacle, this little tent that we've carried around with us for all of these years. I want to build a temple for God. Which sounds like a noble thing, doesn't it? I mean, that seems like a good thing to do. We should build a house for God. I've already built my own palace. It's impressive. We should build an equally impressive house for God. God says to David, no, I don't want you to do that. In fact, I'm going to allow your son to do that, but here's what I will do for you. Instead of you building a house for me, I'm going to establish your kingship over the people of Israel from now until eternity. So he says through a guy named Nathan the prophet, moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house, not you make him a house. He'll establish your house. When your days are fulfilled and when you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and in accordance with all of this vision, Nathan spoke to David. And what David recognizes in this moment is that God has given him a more significant gift than just being the person who builds the temple. God has given to David and to his sons over the people of Israel rulership, reign, the kingship, perpetually, from son to son to son to son, until we get to the point, and just throw this part of the story at you, until we get to the point in the story where Jesus comes as the son of who? David, right? Remember that? To rule and reign in his father's place. But David understands that he's a king only so far as he represents God's kingship to his people. It's not about David. It's not about his glory and his honor and his power. It's about him being a representative of God to the people of God. It's a critical understanding because Israel as a kingdom was never meant to be this world-dominating power, but it was just meant to be a beachhead of sorts. It was meant to be an outpost of the kingdom of God among all of the kingdoms of the earth, holding space in that time and in that place until heaven and until earth could be united together again. And David understands his place as a representative of God to the people. And as with all earthly kingdoms, David will eventually die. God says, at some point, your time comes to an end, and it will pass on to your son. But David had a lot of sons, like a lot of kings had a lot of sons. And when a king dies, it often creates a little bit of a power struggle in the wake of the death of the king. And so when David comes towards the end of his life and it begins to be apparent to all of his sons that he's about to die, his oldest son stands up and says, I want to be named the king. I'm the oldest of all of the sons. And he creates a little following for himself, goes off and declares himself the king, blows the trumpets down and says, hey, here is King Adonijah, who you have never heard of, have you? No. But you have heard of a guy named Solomon, because David has already promised the throne to his son Solomon. And in this little power vacuum that happens on the verge of David's death, David says, I need to establish how things are going to go from here. In 1 Kings chapter 1, he says it this way, King David said, call to me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. Benaiah the son of Jehoiada is his military commander. He says, I want the priest, I want the prophet, and I need the dude with the swords. You get all three of those guys together. And then when you get all three of those guys together, they came before the king, and the king said to them, I want you to take with you the servants of your Lord and have Solomon my son ride on my own mule, and I want you to bring him down to Gihon, and let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet there anoint him king over Israel. Then I want you to blow the trumpet and say, long live King Solomon. You shall then come up after him, and he shall come and sit on my throne, for he shall be king in my place. And I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, the guy with the sword, answered the king and said, Amen. May the Lord, the God of my Lord the king, say so. As the Lord has been with my Lord the king, even so may he be with Solomon. David makes all of the arrangements for the coronation ceremony, down to Solomon riding on his own mule, a symbol of his authority, and says that there I want you to declare him to be the next king. And as God has been with me, I want you to understand that he will be with my son. As God has been with me and has represented himself to the world through me, now I want him to do that through my son. And one of the ways Solomon chooses to do that is by building a massive temple to the Lord. A huge, physically imposing structure in the center of Jerusalem that would become for the people the symbol of God's presence, the symbol of heaven coming to earth among them. And here's how the story closes out after Solomon has built the temple. Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. Then the priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house. And it was the duty of the trumpeters and the singers to make themselves heard in unison in praise and thanksgiving to the Lord. And when the song was raised with trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever, the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. And on this day, when they dedicate the temple, a massive band with trumpets and cymbals, they may have even had tambourines, the pastor may have allowed that at that place, all together, they sang and they gave praise to God in this temple that Solomon had built, but which they understand could not possibly contain the greatness of their God. And yet it is filled with God's glory and with God's goodness in that place. And even if it's just for a brief moment, it's almost as if the people of God see that heaven has come to earth in this place, the world being made the way that it was meant to be just for that moment. But, as you might expect, that does not last long because they are human. And Solomon, who is just as wise as any person on the planet has ever been, is also human. And over the course of Solomon's life, from this really incredible high moment, things go badly downhill for Solomon. He begins, instead of just worshiping the Lord his God, he begins to worship all the other gods of the 700 wives that he accumulates for himself, and the concubines that come in to the house as well. And by the time Solomon's time comes to an end, God has already said, look, you have messed this up badly, and I'm going to take away from you the rule, and your son is going to rule in your place, but he's just going to rule a small part of the kingdom, and the rest of the kingdom is going to be given over to someone else. And Solomon's son, Rehoboam, who you don't know because he's sort of forgettable, Rehoboam, after Solomon dies, stands up in front of the people and says, my father built this country on your backs, and you thought that he was hard. I'm going to be worse. I'm going to be more difficult. I'm going to tax you more greatly. I'm going to cost more of your people as servants to my kingdom, and you think you want me to lighten the load. I'm going to make life more difficult for you. And so here's how that ends. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of affairs brought about by God that the Lord might fulfill his word, which he spoke by Ahijah a prophet, the Shilonite, to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Each of you to your own tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David. So all Israel went to their house, but Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in a small little section called Judah. Essentially, I know that I'm not supposed to say this in church, but essentially all of the people of Israel, when they hear Rehoboam's strategy, they sort of give him the middle finger and they decide to walk away. They're like, we don't want anything to do with you. That's like the Bible way of saying what happened, right? They just said, no, thank you, Rehoboam. We're not really interested in serving you. We're going to go our own way. We're going to choose a leader for ourselves, a guy named Jeroboam. And Jeroboam goes off and sets up his kingdom in the north. David's sons continue to rule in the southern kingdom, but the vast majority of Israel is ruled by another guy named Jeroboam. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom will turn back to the house of David. If this people go up to offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of the people will turn again to their Lord, to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And so the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, you have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And Jeroboam begins his rule and his reign, building a rival temple and a rival kingdom and a rival set of gods, and says we don't need to go down to Jerusalem, because if you start going down to Jerusalem and you see the massive temple down there, you might be reminded that that's where you belong. And so instead of allowing you to go down to Jerusalem, I'm just going to make it more convenient for you to worship up here. And instead of going and worshiping Yahweh in the temple where the glory of God filled it and all the songs and the cymbals and the trumpets and all of that sort of stuff, you just come here. And I'll make 2 golden calves. Does this sound familiar? Like what happened in the wilderness with Moses when he came down from the mountain and there was a golden calf there and they were all worshiping it. And he says the same thing that Aaron said to the people of Israel out there in the wilderness when he made the golden calf. He says, behold your gods, O Israel. These are the ones who brought you out of Egypt. And Jeroboam sets his kingdom in motion on a really bad track. And what happens is these two separate but sort of united nations follow their own path, sort of parallel journeys down through the next several hundred years. Judah continues under the reign of David's sons. Israel continues under the reign of Jeroboam and his sons, and then there's a whole lot of political intrigue that happens and lots of, if you want to read some of that sort of stuff, you like that, enjoy that sort of stuff, that's all in there. Kings and Chronicles is filled with it. And in the south, there are every once in a while, there is a good king who rises up in Judah and leads the people back in a relationship with God. But the majority of them are sort of a mess. And all of the kings in the north who start off in Jeroboam's kingdom are a mess. And the people of God, as they follow these leaders, are a mess, shockingly. While this is all going on, the last piece, the fifth act that I would talk about is what I would call a conversation. And the main figure in here is a bunch of different people named the prophets, just generically. There are a whole bunch of prophets. There are people who are brought along by God from different times and different moments to speak to his people. And perhaps this part is most important because most often in the Gospels, Jesus is identified this way by people. This is a prophet. This is a person sent by God to speak to us, to tell us what we're doing wrong, and to invite us back into relationship with God. The tradition of the prophets goes way back through the story of Israel. In many ways found its first formal kind of role in the person of Samuel, who was the one who anointed David. And then in Nathan, the prophet to David. And then others who came after just continued on this conversation between God and the king and between God and the people. And most often what the prophets did was they told the people uncomfortable truths. This is generally what people who have this sort of, they were not necessarily welcome everywhere. The things that they said were not always received all that well because oftentimes they were telling people things that they didn't want to hear. Perhaps the most notable name in that tradition is a man named Elijah, who prophesies in that northern kingdom under Jeroboam's sons and later on all of the different guys that come after him, but doesn't write down his own words. Elijah never wrote anything down. We just have stories of him recorded in Kings. And he's known for his mighty works, and he's known for his bold and direct confrontation with the king that was over Israel at the time, a man named Ahab. But he's also known for his strong connection to God. He speaks as an authorized herald of God's kingdom to people who ought to have been subjects of God, but have found themselves in opposition to that kingdom, some knowingly and other times unknowingly. But God continues to speak to his people. And at the end of Elijah's life, he passes on his role and his responsibility to another guy named Elisha, another prophet, another messenger of God to the people. And the transition between these two is significant. And I'm just going to read it just so that you can hear this, because you may have heard references to this part of the story at some point or another before. When they had crossed over the river, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I'm taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please, let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." And he said, "You have asked a hard thing, yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." And as they still went on and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." And he saw him no more. And then he took hold of his own clothes and tore them in two pieces. And he took up the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he struck the water, saying, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" We've Some of you have probably heard some reference to Elijah, chariots of fire, if you saw the movie or whatever. But you've recognized, right, this is a significant moment, a transition from this mighty man of God to the prophet that comes after him. And when Elisha takes up Elijah's cloak and strikes the water with it, he asks this question: where's the Lord, the God of Elijah? Where is the one who's going to be with me to speak to this people? Because these people are a mess. And I'm going to need your presence with me to communicate to this people the things that they need to hear and the things that they need to see. And Elijah holds this place in the hearts and minds of the people of Israel because they believed this story that Elijah was taken up by a whirlwind into heaven, and they believed that there would come a day when God would rescue and renew his people, and Elijah would come again to the people. And they believed that when they saw Elijah again returning to the people, that would be a signal to them that God was rescuing and redeeming his people. And that when God rescued and redeemed his people, he would do for them the thing that only he could do for them. He would save them from all of their sin, from all of their sorrow, from all of their bondage, that he would do for them the thing that only God could do. And Elijah, Elisha, they don't write anything down. But there are other prophets that we have that make up a huge piece of what we would call the Old Testament. And there's no way that we could possibly cover all of them. So I'm going to cover all of them in the next 10 minutes, max. Good luck. What they do is they consistently write to the people, speak to the people, and tell the people, you are being invited into relationship with your Heavenly Father. You've disobeyed. You are a mess. You are broken. You've made a total disaster of this thing. But there is coming a day in which God will renew his covenant with you, in which, for the sake of Abraham, for Isaac, and Jacob, those patriarchs that by this point are just ancient history, that God would rescue his people and would reunite heaven and earth again in these people. And as they look to that future day, they look to the conclusion of the story, which looks very much like the beginning of the story, which is that heaven comes to earth as the place where God would rule. I'm going to read from 4 of these prophets. Jeremiah chapter 31 says it this way. Jeremiah, who ministers sort of 600 or so years before Jesus comes. Jeremiah says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. Now, if you are a person living in the time of Jeremiah, when the southern kingdom of Judah that's been living under the rule of David's sons for the last 500 or so years is about to crumble and fall, and you recognize that it's because you as a people have been such a mess, and you hear the prophet say, there's coming a day when I will forgive all of their iniquity and I will remember their sin no more. That sounds like incredibly good news. That sounds like a day that you would look forward to. That sounds like a day that you would hold on to. That sounds like a day when you would remember that heaven was coming to earth in your midst. That it wouldn't be just a law that was written on tablets of stone, but that it would be written on your hearts. That it wouldn't be up to you to tell someone else what it would look like for them to be in relationship with their Heavenly Father, but that they could know it for themselves. That sounds like incredibly good news. There's another prophet who prophesies just after the destruction of Jerusalem, just after the captivity to Babylon, when the people of God had been taken away. And he looks and says it this way. It's a weird guy named Ezekiel. It says, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out in the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the middle of the valley, and it was full of bones. And he led me around among them, and behold, there were very many on the surface of the valley, and behold, they were very dry. And he said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord God, you know. Then he said to me, prophesy over these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord. Ezekiel prophesying to a scattered people like a valley full of dead, dry bones, wondering if their God could do anything with them ever again, says the answer to that question is yes. It's always yes. That despite your disobedience, despite your sinfulness, despite your brokenness, despite all of the ways in which you have made a complete mess and disaster of things, there is always hope. I am your hope. I'll breathe life into you. I'll put those bones back together into a living, breathing human being. Ezekiel says, wait for the day when the Spirit of the Lord speaks to the people of God, raises them up out of the dead, brings them back to life. There's a prophet named Daniel. We've talked about this one already in the Jesus Project story. Daniel looks down into the future coming day, and he says it this way. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. And Jesus' favorite and most common description of himself ties back into this image from the prophet Daniel that says, one like a son of man is going to be presented the rulership and the kingship over all of the earth, not just over Israel and its people, but over all of the earth. And when this one comes, and when his rule and his reign is established, then you would see what it looks like for heaven to come to earth. And the last one that we'll cover is a guy named Isaiah. Even though he comes first, I put this one last because I liked this one to kind of close this piece out. He says a lot of different things. Actually, he's the most quoted prophet in the entire New Testament and in all of the Gospels. Most of the allusions and direct references that we've read so far and that we will read in the series come from Isaiah. But I'm not going to read any of those. Instead, I'm going to read this one. It's at the end of Isaiah's prophecy. He says, behold, I create a new heaven and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be a gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. And Isaiah, as he closes down his massive book, prophecy, says there's coming a day when a new heaven and a new earth will be the reality that we live in. There's coming a day in which heaven comes to meet earth. The two of them walk together like they were supposed to walk from the beginning. It's coming a day when all of the former things won't be remembered anymore. And instead, I will establish this new reality for the world to live in. There's coming a day that we as a people look forward to, Isaiah says, when Yahweh, our God, makes all things new again. When God takes all of the old and broken things and restores them and makes them new. That is the story that Israel was living in, that Jesus was living in, and that Jesus was preaching to. It was the people who believed that these things were going to be real. They were expecting a coming day when heaven would come to earth. They were expecting a coming day when God would renew his covenant with his people. They were living in between their destruction and their anticipated renewal. They were living in this perpetual state of feeling like they were home, but were not quite home. They were living, in other words, in the consequences of their brokenness and in the consequences of their sin. The two acts, David's crown and the conversation with the prophets, walked together hand in hand for several hundred years until the end of the story looks like this. Then the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently to them by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. And when the Old Testament closes, this is the world that they're living in. They're living in a world where they believe that God is going to come and rescue and redeem them someday, but that he has not come to do that yet. Other people have risen up and have said, God's going to rescue us, God's going to rescue us, God's going to rescue us, God's going to redeem us. And all of those people die. And all of those rebellions fall flat. And all of those people who try to bring the people together and unite the people together, it all fails. And as it fails, every time it fails, it's like their hopes die again. It's like their belief that heaven could come to earth dies again. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait. That's the world that Jesus came to. A world that was waiting. A world that was hoping and expecting. That's the world that Jesus speaks into. That's the world that Jesus heals into. That's the world that Jesus brings hope of heaven to earth for. So here's the summary. Last two things that you need to remember about the Old Testament. 5 things that you need to know. If you don't remember anything else, it's Cliff Notes version. 39 books of the Bible. 4th thing, the Hebrew worldview took seriously belief that their king in the line of David was meant to express the good and gracious rule of Yahweh like a shepherd over the people of God. And they believed that one would come from the line of David, and that when that one came from the line of David, they would be able to recognize him as their king because he lived in the way that David had lived as king over the people of Israel. That he would do it with compassion for his people and with complete and utter disregard for himself. 5th, the Hebrew worldview. This is what Jesus' audience believed. That the prophets had been sent as messengers from God to tell about a coming day in which the covenant between God and his people would be renewed, which would mean that an everlasting kingdom of heaven was being established on the earth. And that was what they were hoping for. It wasn't that they were hoping that Israel would just become this national power, this world-dominating power. They believed that heaven was supposed to come to earth through them. And that when that one came, who came for that purpose, that is exactly what God would do.